back. We are going to be continuing reading Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. Last we left off was we're in the middle of chapter 5. So this is part 2 of chapter 5 today. So thanks for joining me again. So again, here's Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. We left off last night with Harry and Ron taking Ron's dad's flying car to Hogwarts instead of taking the train like they were supposed to, because when they went to go get onto platform 9 3/4, they couldn't get through. So to solve that problem, they just jumped into Ron's dad's car and took off, and they flew over the train the whole way. But as they got to the castle, their car started having some difficulties and they crash landed. And we left off last night with Harry and Ron being jostled in this car and things hitting the car. So Ron says, "What happened?" Or "What's happened?" And Ron gasps, staring through the windshield, and Harry looked around just in time to see a branch as thick as a python smash into it. The tree that they had hit was attacking them. Its trunk was bent almost double, and its gnarled boughs were pummeling every inch of the car it could reach. "Ah!" said Ron as another twisted limb punched a large dent into his door. The windshield was now trembling under a hail of blows from knuckle-like twigs, and branches as thick as battering rams was pounding furiously on the roof, which seemed to be caving. "Run for it!" Ron shouted, throwing his full weight against his door, and the next second he had been knocked backward onto Harry's lap by a vicious uppercut from another branch. "We're done for," he moaned as the ceiling sagged, but suddenly the floor of the car was vibrating. The engine had restarted. "Reverse!" Harry yelled, and the car shot backward, and the tree was still trying to hit them. They could hear its roots creaking as it almost ripped itself up, lashing out at them as they sped out of reach. "That," panted Ron, "was close. Well done, car." And the car, however, had reached the end of its tether. With two sharp clunks, the door flew open, and Harry felt his seat tip sideways. Next thing he knew, he was sprawled out on the damp ground. Loud thuds next to him that the car was ejecting their luggage from the trunk. Hedwig's cage flew through the air and burst open, and she rose out of it with an angry screech and sped off toward the castle. Without looking back, or without a backward look, then dented, scratched, and steaming, the car rumbled off into the darkness, its rear lights blazing angrily. "Come back!" Ron yelled after it, brandishing his broken wand. "Dad'll kill me!" But the car disappeared from view with one last snort from its exhaust. "Can you believe our luck?" said Ron miserably, bending down to pick up Scabbers. "Of all the trees we could have hit, we get that one that hits back." He glanced over his shoulder, and the ancient tree, which was still flailing its branches threateningly. "Come on," said Harry wearily. "We better get back to the school." It wasn't all the triumphant arrival that they had pictured. Stiff, cold, and bruised, they seized the ends of their trunks and began dragging them up the grassy slope toward the great oak front doors. "I think the feast has already started," said Ron, dropping his trunk at the foot of the front steps and crossing quietly to look through the brightly lit window. "Hey, Harry, come and look. It's the sorting." Harry hurried over, and together he and Ron peered into the great hall. Innumerable candles were hovering in midair over 4 long crowded tables, making the golden plates and goblets sparkle. Overhead, the bewitching ceiling, which was always mirrored the sky outside, sparkled with stars. Through the forest of pointed black Hogwarts hats, Harry saw a long line of scared-looking first years filing into the hall. Ginny was among them, easily visible because of her vivid Weasley hair. Meanwhile, Professor McGonagall, a bespectacled witch with her hair in a tight bun, was placing the famous Hogwarts sorting hat on the stool before the newcomers. Every year, this age-old hat, patched, frayed, and dirty, sorted new students into 4 Hogwarts houses: Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin. Harry well remembered putting it on exactly 1 year ago and waiting, petrified, for its decision as it muttered aloud in his ear. For a few horrible seconds, he had feared that the hat was going to put him in Slytherin, the house that had turned out more dark witches and wizards than any other. But he had ended up in Gryffindor, along with Ron, Hermione, and the rest of the Weasleys. Last term, Harry and Ron had helped Gryffindor win the house championship, beating Slytherin for the first time in 7 years. A very small, mousy-haired boy had been called forward to place the hat on his head. Harry's eyes widened past him to where Professor Dumbledore, the headmaster, sat watching the sorting hat from the staff table. His long silver beard and half-mooned glasses shined brightly in the candlelight. Several seats along, Harry saw Gilderoy Lockhart dressed in robes of aquamarine. Not just blue-green, aquamarine. And there, at the end, was Hagrid, huge and hairy, drinking deeply from his goblet. "Hang on," Harry muttered to Ron. "There's an empty chair at the staff table. Where's Snape?" Professor Severus Snape was Harry's least favorite teacher. Harry also happened to be Snape's least favorite student. Cruel, sarcastic, and disliked by everyone except the students from his own house, Slytherin. Snape taught potions. "Maybe he's ill," said Ron, hopefully. "Maybe he's left," said Harry, "because he missed out on Defense Against the Dark Arts job again." "Or he might have been sacked," said Ron enthusiastically. "I mean, everyone hates him." "Or maybe," said a very cold voice right behind them, "he's waiting to hear why you two didn't arrive by the school train." Harry spun around. There, his black robes rippling in the cold breeze, stood Severus Snape. He was a thin man with sallow skin, a hooked nose, and greasy shoulder-length black hair. And at this moment, he was smiling in a way that told Harry and Ron were in very deep trouble. "Follow me," said Snape. Not daring even to look at each other, Harry and Ron followed Snape up the steps into the vast, echoing entrance hall, which was lit with flaming torches. A delicious smell of food was wafting from the great hall, but Snape led them away from the warmth and light, down a narrow stone staircase that led into the dungeons. "In," he said, pointing in the door halfway down the cold passageway. They entered Snape's office, shivering. The shadowy walls were lined with shelves of large glass jars in which floated all manner of revolting things. Harry really didn't want to know the name of it this moment. The fireplace was dark and empty. Snape closed the door and turned to look at them. "So," he said softly, "the train isn't good enough for the famous Harry Potter and his faithful sidekick Weasley? Wanted to arrive with a bang, did we, boys?" "No, sir. It was the barrier at King's Cross that—" "Silence," said Snape coldly. "What have you done with the car?" Ron gulped. It wasn't the first time Snape had given Harry the impression of being able to read minds, but a moment later he understood as Snape unrolled today's issue of the Evening Prophet. "You were seen," he hissed, showing them the headlines. "Flying Ford Anglia mystifies Muggles." He had begun to read aloud. Two Muggles in London, convinced they saw an old car flying over the post office tower at noon in Norfolk. Mrs. Hetty Bayliss, while hanging out her washing, Mr. Angus Fleet of Pebbles reported to the police. 6 or 7 Muggles in all. "I believe your father works for the Misuse of Muggles Artifacts Office," he said, looking up at Ron and smiling still more nastily. Dear, his own son. Harry felt as though he had been walloped in the stomach by one of the mad tree's larger branches. If anyone found out Mr. Weasley had bewitched the car, he hadn't thought of that. "I noticed in my search of the park that considerable damage seems to be done to a very valuable Whomping Willow," Snape went on. "That tree did more damage to us than we—" Ron blurted out. "Silence!" snapped Snape again. "Most unfortunately, you are not in my house, and the decision to expel you does not rest with me. I shall go to fetch the people who do have the happy power. You will wait here." Harry and Ron stared at each other, white-faced. Harry didn't feel hungry anymore. He now felt extremely sick, and he tried not to look into the large, slimy something suspended in green liquid on the shelf behind Snape's desk. If Snape had gone to fetch Professor McGonagall, head of Gryffindor House, then they were hardly any better off. She might be fairer than Snape, but she was still extremely strict. 10 minutes later, Snape returned, and sure enough, it was Professor McGonagall who accompanied him. Harry had seen Professor McGonagall angry on several occasions, but either he had forgotten just how thin her mouth could go, or he had never seen her this angry before. She raised her wand the moment she entered, and Harry and Ron both flinched, but she merely pointed at the empty fireplace where flames suddenly erupted. "Sit," she said, and they both sat back into the chairs by the fire. "Explain," she said, and her glasses glinted ominously. Ron launched into the story, starting with the barrier at the station refusing to let them through. "So, we had no choice, Professor. We couldn't get on the train. Why didn't you send us a letter by owl? I believe you have an owl," Professor McGonagall said coldly to Harry. When Harry gaped at her, now she said it, it seemed the obvious thing to have done. I didn't think." "That," said Professor McGonagall, "is obvious." There was a knock at the office door, and Snape, now looking happier than ever, opened it, and there stood Headmaster Professor Dumbledore. Harry's whole body went numb. Dumbledore was looking unusually grave, and he stared down from his very crooked nose at them. And Harry suddenly found himself wishing he and Ron were still being beaten by the Whomping Willow. There was a long silence, and Dumbledore said, "Please explain why you did this." It would have been better if he had shouted. Harry hated the disappointment in his voice. For some reason, he was unable to look Dumbledore in the eyes, and spoke instead to his niece. He told Dumbledore everything except that Mr. Weasley owned the bewitched car, making it sound as though he and Ron had happened to find a flying car parked outside the station. He knew Dumbledore would see through this at once, but Dumbledore asked no questions about the car. When Harry had finished, he merely continued to peer at him through his spectacles. "We'll go and get our stuff," said Ron in a hopeless sort of voice. "What are you talking about, Weasley?" barked Professor McGonagall. "Well, you're expelling us, aren't you?" said Ron. Harry looked quickly at Dumbledore. Not today, Mr. Weasley, said Dumbledore, but I must impress upon both of you the seriousness of what you have done. I will be writing to both of your families tonight, and I must also warn you that if you do anything like this again, I will have no choice but to expel you. Snape looked as though Christmas had been cancelled. He cleared his throat and said, Professor Dumbledore, these boys have flouted the decree of restriction of underage wizardry, caused serious damage to an old and valuable tree. Surely, acts of this nature. It will be for Professor McGonagall to decide on these boys' punishments, Severus, said Dumbledore calmly. They are in her house, and they are therefore her responsibility. He turned to Professor McGonagall. I must get back to the feast, Minerva said, I've got to give out a few notices. Come, Severus, there's a delicious-looking custard tart I want to sample. Snape shot a look of pure venom to Harry and Ron as he allowed himself to be swept out of his office, leaving them alone with Professor McGonagall, who was still eyeing them still eyeing them like a wrathful eagle. You'd better get along to the hospital wing, Weasley. You're bleeding. Not much, said Ron, hastily wiping the cut over his eye with his sleeve. Professor, I wanted to watch my sister being sorted. The sorting ceremony is over, said Professor McGonagall. Your sister is also in Gryffindor. Oh, good, said Ron. And speaking of Gryffindor, Professor McGonagall said sharply, but Harry cut in. Professor, when we took that car, term hadn't started, so Gryffindor shouldn't really have points taken away from it, should it? He finished, watching her anxiously, and Professor McGonagall gave him a piercing look. But he wasn't sure. She had almost smiled, and her mouth looked less thin anyway. I will not take any points from Gryffindor, she said, and Harry's heart lightened considerably. But you will both get detention. It was better than Harry had expected. As for Dumbledore's writing to the Dursleys, that was nothing. Harry knew perfectly well that they'd just be disappointed that the Whopping Willow hadn't squashed him flat. Professor McGonagall raised her wand again and pointed at Snape's desk. A large plate of sandwiches, 2 silver goblets, and a jug of iced pumpkin juice appeared with a pop. You will eat in here and then go straight up to your dormitory, she said. I must also return to the feast. And when the door had closed behind her, Ron let out a long, low whistle. I thought we had done it, he said, grabbing a sandwich. So did I, said Harry, and taking one too. Can you believe our luck, though? Said Ron thickly through a mouthful of chicken and ham. Fred and George must have flown the car 5 or 6 times, and no muggle ever saw them. He swallowed and took another huge bite. Why couldn't we get through the barrier? Harry shrugged. We'll have to watch our step from now on, though, he said, taking a grateful swig of pumpkin juice. Wish we could have gone up to the feast. She didn't want us showing off, said Ron sagely. Doesn't want people to think that it's clever, arriving by a flying car. And when they had eaten as many sandwiches as they could, the plate kept refilling itself. Ooh, I like that. A plate that magically refills itself and never gets empty. They rose and left the office, trading the familiar path to the Gryffindor Tower. The castle was quiet, and it seemed that the feast was over. They walked past muttering portraits of creaking suits of armor and climbed narrow flights of stone stairs until at last they reached the passage to the secret entrance to Gryffindor Tower, or where Gryffindor Tower was hidden, behind the oil painting of a very fat woman in a pink silk dress. Password? She said as they approached. Said Harry. They didn't know the New Year's password, not having met the Gryffindor prefect yet. But help came almost immediately. They heard hurrying feet behind them and turned to see Hermione dashing toward them. There you are! Where have you been? The most ridiculous rumors. Someone said that you'd been expelled for crashing a flying car. Well, we haven't been expelled, Harry assured her. You're not telling me you did fly here, said Hermione, sounding almost as severe as Professor McGonagall. Skip the lecture, said Ron impatiently, and tell us the new password. It's Wattlebird, said Hermione impatiently, but that's not the point. Her words were cut short, however, in the as the portrait of the fat lady swung open, and there was a sudden storm of clapping. It looked as though the whole of Gryffindor House was still awake, packed into the circular common room, standing on the lopsided tables and squashy armchairs, waiting for them to arrive. Arms reached through the portrait hole to pull Harry and Ron in, leaving Hermione to scramble in after them. Brilliant! Yelled Lee Jordan. Inspired! What an entrance! Flying a car right into a whopping willow? People will be talking about that one for years. Good for you, said a fifth year Harry had never spoken to. Someone was patting him on the back as though he had just won a marathon. Fred and George pushed their way to the front of the crowd and said together, "We couldn't have come up in a car, eh?" Ron said, scarlet in the face, grinning embarrassedly, but Harry could see one person who didn't look happy at all. Percy was visible over the heads of some excited first years, and he seemed to be trying to get near enough to start telling them off. Harry nudged Ron in the ribs and nudged and nodded in Percy's direction. Ron got the point at once. "Gotta get upstairs, bit tired," he said, and the two of them started pushing their way toward the door on the other side of the room, which led to the spiral staircase and the dormitories. "Night!" Harry called back to Hermione, who was wearing a scowl just like Percy's. They managed to get to the other side of the common room, still having their backs clapped, and gained the piece of the staircase. They had hurried up it right to the top and last reached the door of their old dormitory, which now had a sign on it saying second years. They entered the familiar circular room with its 5 four-posters hung with red velvet and its high, narrow windows. Their trunks had been brought up for them and stood at the end of their beds. Ron grinned guiltily at Harry. "I know, I should have enjoyed that. I shouldn't have enjoyed that or anything, but..." The dormitory door flew open and came the other second-year Gryffindor boys, Seamus Finnegan, Dean Thomas, and Neville Longbottom. "Unbelievable," beamed Seamus. "Cool," said Dean. "Amazing," said Neville, awestruck. Harry couldn't help it. He grinned too. Right, and that is the end of chapter 5. We'll start with chapter 6, which is Gilderoy Lockhart, and you can see the little plant being pulled up there with the baby at the bottom. It's a baby plant, huh? Get it? So we'll read chapter 6 next. I hope you all have enjoyed this. Don't forget to sound off in the comment section below. If you want to be featured, just write down your summary and I'll gladly read it. Thanks for hanging out with me, guys, and I will see you in the next video. Take care, everybody.